Okay, so Brother Jacob asked me to step in this week. He's not here for class, so he'll pick it up next week. And so I'm just going to do a class here this morning. As you can see up above, it's about decision making. And I'm going to give you as they say, I'm going to give you the punchline first, lest we go into our discussions later and we miss the whole point of this. And that's found in Jeremiah 10. And verse 23. Jeremiah 10, verse 23. O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. And this talks about our decisions that we make in life. Now, I've chosen a particular area of the Bible to talk about decision making. There are hundreds that we could talk about. And in this case, we're going to be talking about a married couple, but that doesn't mean those that aren't married get off the hook and say, well, this doesn't apply to me. But it does. It has to do with how we go about making decisions and what the implications of those decisions are. Go down. Yeah, I'm gonna try. No. Oh, is it there? Yeah, I was over there. So we're going to talk about Abraham and Sarah. You can turn over Genesis 16, if you will. We're going to talk about their decision-making process, and here we are several thousand years later, and we're going to critique their decision-making and see whether or not we agree with them on how things happen. Now, you can kind of see all the questions ahead of time, but I want to get a reader here, if we could, for Genesis 16, verses 1 through 5. So anyone like to raise their hand? Okay.
I'll go first since I have the microphone. Genesis 16, 1 through 5 reads, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant, whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, Now see, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So when he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarah said to Abram, My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me.
Okay, so there's a lot to actually, as they say, unpack here in this decision making. There's a lot going on in this discussion. And you can see by the very first question here that Sarai, her name hasn't been changed yet, nor has Abram's name been changed yet, comes to Abram and says, look, we're both kind of getting up there in years. I don't think we're going to have children. She also mentions here that the Lord restrains her from bearing children. So she comes over to Abram and says, let's have a discussion about this. It doesn't look we're going to have children. We need to continue the family line. This is very important, obviously, to continue the family line. And likewise, Abram, you've received promises from the Lord, have you not? That says you're going to make you a great nation. It's going to be kind of hard to do that without having kids. And so the question is how reasonable is Sarai being with Abraham? Like, hey, let's just have this discussion here. What do you think? I've got an idea here for you. I'm going to throw this idea out to you, Abram. What do you think about this? By the way, where did Sarai get the idea that the Lord had restrained her from bearing children. Any ideas? Well, we can certainly think about when Pharaoh took her and all the wombs of Egypt were closed up. And of course, he summons back Abram and says, what's going on here? Wait a minute, this is your wife, not your sister. Anyway, she says that God has restrained her from having children, which is an interesting comment about having children in general. Now, I'll share with you something that it sounds a little humorous, but and I shouldn't have done it. Once a few years back, I did a talk. I think it was at a gathering or wherever, and I titled the subject, "Where do children come from?" And I think the front row of sisters all fainted at the title of the talk. But the idea of this was, how do children really come about? Is this by the will of man, or is it by the will of God? And here, it appears that Sarai is saying, this comes from the will of God, not from you and I, Abram, but God is the one that's restraining me from having children. So, let's just do kind of a group little survey here. How many think that Sarai's request is fairly reasonable? In other words, hey, we got a little problem here. I got a solution. What do you think about it? So everyone that thinks that Sarai's idea here is really not all that a bad one, maybe raise your hand. You think it's a great idea. You know, hey, this is not a bad idea.
It's my hand with explanation.
Oh, okay, with explanation, okay.
So I guess the times and the standards of polygamy in that time were a little bit more open, if you will.
Yep.
So for that reason, I don't think it was God's will. I think it was short-sighted, kind of taking things into her own hands. They were both taking things into their own hands instead of trusting God. But I could see the logic behind it.
Yeah, I mean, was she denying God was involved at all in this? Did she make any comment like that? Good.
When Isaac and Rebekah were not able to have children for 20 years, it says that Isaac prayed to the Lord, and then Rebekah became pregnant. So, but you don't really read that about Sarah. You know, I mean, it doesn't say Rebekah prayed to the Lord. It says she prayed when the children were in her womb, you know. But we know that Abraham had said, you know, what descendant are you going to provide for me? All I have here is this Eliezer. And I can't remember if that happened before this or after. But, you know, I think Sarah was one of these people who she thought of the end result, but she didn't think about all the steps in between.
Yeah.
And of course, we know the outcome. So that's why none of us are really raising our hands.
But think now, has at this point, Abram and Sarai, do they know that the child is going to come through Sarah? The promises are given first to Abram. Do we, remember it says, I'll make you, he says, Abram, we can look it up, where God says to Abram, I'm going to make you a great nation. Was in the promise included in that Sarai, your wife, is going to have the lineage through you? Was that apparent to them? Did you have something, Randy?
I was just going to make a comment that this falls into the pattern that they had in the past of trying to, you know, take care of things that they thought would be a problem. You know, 2 times they went and he said, "This is my sister," and it caused problems. So this fits a pattern of the 2 of them trying to solve problems before they're thinking ahead, but they're trying to solve it themselves rather than fully relying on God.
No, it does not say that the child would come through Sarah, but if God made man and wife from the very beginning, it's only logical that it would come through Sarah.
Okay. By the way, do we, go ahead, did you have something?
So, in answer to your original question, did they think or feel like God was involved in things? I could see from from the things they say they do, the problem was they lacked the proper faith to let God follow through with what they knew he was capable of doing. The surprise in her mind when he said, "You're having the baby," was unbelievable. Like, you believe in the nature of the flesh more than you do in the power of God, who controls all those things.
Well, God has promised that he's going to be a great nation. He hasn't told them how he's going to make him a great nation. And so that's really part of this ambiguity here.
A lot of times, and I think in their case, they look at, all right, I got about 20 years to have a child before I can't have a child. And it's got to happen by then, or it's not going to happen. Of course, with God, you can have a child at 100 years old if he wants you to. So they don't, but we don't naturally think that way, that, okay, this can happen 50 years from now if it's God's will, and I just have to be patient and wait for it. Because by the normal nature of the world we live in, we feel like we're on a limited schedule here. So if it ain't going to happen, I'm going to make it happen.
Yeah. So if we stop and think about it, and I'm not going to go through the timeline here, but it appears that Abraham is about 87 years old. Sarah would have been 9 years younger, 79. So and that's probably the maximum age for the two of them, but they may have even been younger than that. But this conversation here is amongst the couple that's, Sarah is saying, look, we're both getting up here in age. Come on, let's be honest here. I'm not going to have, what are the chances? I'm not going to have a child, okay, at this older age. So now you mentioned, I think it was Walter mentioned about lack of faith. I believe in this. So what's the proper response here for them, and we'll see that in bullet point 3, was the proper response for them to pray about this? And we don't know this, of course, had they prayed about it, but would the proper response of agreeing to this be without praying about it? Is that the problem here? It's the problem, not so much the discussion about Hagar, which is going to come into this, but it's the real problem that neither one of them appear to come to the Lord and say, okay, well, Lord, I know I'm going to be a great nation, but I got a problem here, and my wife's, it's pretty obvious. We're not at a childbearing age, and so we have this, we'll call it opportunity to have one through, in this case, Hagar. Now, by the way, I wanted to bring in this part about Hagar. Hagar is a slave child, probably a servant of Sarai, probably one of the gifts, if you will, that Pharaoh made when he sent Abram and Sarai away. So, here's a bunch of slaves, here's some money. It's also how Abram got very rich. That's not what he wanted, was going after, but that's how the Lord gave him all that. So does Hagar get to agree? Should that have even been an issue? Remember, she's a slave girl. Or do we say, well, we're going to excuse that because she's a slave girl, so you don't get to vote. We all happy with that? Not maybe happy is not the right word, but Hagar is kind of, let's put it this way. Is Hagar a, quote, victim in all of this? An innocent person, let's say. We're going to see a little later, Hagar does have a little bit of a, let's just say, misbehavior along the way. Does Hagar even get a chance to say, okay, Sarah, you want me to go into your husband and have a child? Is that what I understand? Now, this all sounds, in our way of looking at it in today's world, very foreign, although maybe not so foreign, because we do have these things today of surrogate parenthood and things like that. By the way, if we're comfortable with this, is everyone here comfortable with surrogate children? We all happy? Intro, veto, all technology type stuff we have?
you got to remember that Sarah might have borne Pharaoh's child if that wasn't put to a halt. So no, Hagar had no say in the matter.
Okay. Okay, it's just, it's a point here because you're going to see that later Hagar is going to stir up some trouble here, okay? Even though it's Sarah, or Sarai, who introduced this whole idea. Good, sorry.
So theoretically, Hagar was in a position of complete submission as a slave. Now she's got leverage because of what's transpired. So,
Right.
And I'm sure that will reveal.
Yeah, we're going to reveal this here because Hagar is going to take some action here. And even Sarai demonstrates some, I would say, an emotional response. So they make the decision. Abram does. Says, okay, she's your maidservant. I'm going to go along with that. I'm going to listen to what you say. There's apparently no prayer going on here, from what we can tell. And I put the question in there. So when you go to make a decision, now this is a big decision here, but any decision, at what point do we say, this is kind of a trivial matter. There's no point in taking this to the Lord. I mean, it's not really, it's a decision, of course, but it's not maybe at the level of this. And I'll use an example. Some may have heard this. So we're looking eventually to get a second car, okay? Is that something we should take to the Lord? We pray, Lord, we need a car. Is that a valid thing to take, Lord? Where are every decision we make, or before we make it, or is it always up to the Lord? Do we always pray to the Lord and say, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to take this job, or I'm going to go to this college, or I'm going to go do this and that and the other? Is that all a prerequisite of prayer first? We have someone back there.
Well, it says in, the Apostle Paul said in Acts 17, that in him we live and move and have our being. So that, our every thought, our every action, God knows it before we even do it or think it. But yet he loves us and wants to be involved in our lives to the minutest detail. He wants us to live and move and have our being in him. And so I think that, whatever we're doing in our lives, as it says in James, we shouldn't say, oh, well, tomorrow let's go to this city or that city and let's do some business, and things like that. But we should say, if the Lord wills, kind of thing.
And I'll piggyback off that. It's the opposite for me. If I already know what I want, then that's my cue to be more likely not to pray about it.
Well, if you look at, like, some decisions, and we're going to use married couples here at the moment, but
told
any
contrary.
decision in life you make, do you say, this isn't at the level of the Lord? I mean, come on, he's given us free will. He expects us to make some decisions in life, does he not? I mean, or is the Lord saying, hey, I really would like hearing from you. Here's what you're intending to do. And would that, by the way, would that change your mind? You say, well, I don't know. Because again, in Sarah's case, apparently she knows, you get the impression from that, is that they really are trying to have children. When she says, the Lord has restrained me. So it isn't like they weren't trying to have children, okay? They wanted to have, this is all, you go back to the customs of the Middle East and things like that. This is a very important thing to have children. And I can tell you from Italian custom, especially, is that having a son is considered very important, okay? Because again, that's the lineage part of this. And I imagine that's a European thing for sure. But the idea of having children, good example, my brother went down to South America some time ago on business, and he was invited by his clients to go to their house, and they said, now make sure you bring your family too. Bring all the kids, bring everyone. And of course, he wasn't married at the time, I don't believe. But it's an interesting thing, and an interesting psychology of how people look at that.
Yeah, well, I've learned 30, 40 years ago, I wouldn't have taken buying a car or something to the Lord. Today, I would, because I learned that the choices I made without involving God in everything many times backfired. You ended up in a worse place than you were. You might have had a better car, but you were in a worse situation financially or anything like that. So the older I've gotten, the more minute things I take to the Lord. So where he's in just about every decision. So that's just my own education.
Okay.
So one of my perspectives has always been to remember that we are stewards of everything there is around about us that God has given us. It's not ours. But if a good steward will care for the things of his master and ensure that they're done properly, and if he's not sure about, what would his master have him do, he asks him. And so I would say, being good stewards, we should always talk to God and say, hey, I know you gave me free will, but what is your will? That I do this thing correctly? So that's my perspective of it.
That's true. We all have an idea of what we should do. We know it's the right idea.
This wasn't the last time this occurred. You got to remember, Rachel did the same thing, and then Leah did it later. I don't know that the children that the handmaids bore were any worse than the ones that Leah bore, but it's not. It doesn't seem to be that uncommon, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. No.
Yeah, one of the things as we go through the Bible, and it's a repeated thing, it's like God doesn't want blind obedience, okay? Blind obedience doesn't praise him or anything like that, okay? He doesn't need to be in every decision you make, but what he's saying is at least ask for guidance. What you do is your responsibility. You have to deal with the consequences of your decision. But if you ask him beforehand, even with us married couples, how many of us would have married our wives if we hadn't asked, at least for guidance? As we had kids and they grew up and they got older and became more cognizant of what's around them, did we tell them what to do every step of the way, or do we give them guidance on what their choices would be? That's the same thing. God is our Father. Us as parents and fathers and mothers and everything else, we're still guiding our children years later. They make their own decisions, but we can give them guidance.
Go ahead. Did you? Yeah.
I think our Sunday school verse was probably timely because, when it says, you can say to this mountain, move, and it will move. This was certainly a mountain in their lives, and there doesn't seem to be any indication that they took that to the Lord. But that principle, God had, certainly in the life of Abraham, taken him on this journey that would have reinforced that, if you do rely on me, if you do consult me, I can move these mountains in your life. And this was certainly something that they both would have been intimately aware of, the promises. So, as Randy said, a while back, it would just stand to reason that it would be through Sarah as a wife.
Yeah. So the other question in this, and this gets really complicated now, and the Apostle Paul addresses this later, did he make this decision to please Sarai? Did he just say, in fact, if you want, read this whole thing. It's a little bit like Abram is kind of hands off on this whole thing. He's kind of like saying, you're my wife. Yeah, it sounds, I'll tell you what, you do is what you think is good. If Hagar is yours to decide upon, and I'm kind of, but I'm going to do whatever you want because I'm here to please you. I'm here to make you happy. Because if Abram said, nah, not a good idea, don't like the idea, then he's afraid Sarai will say, well, look where we're at.
A couple things there. I agree. Like, it sounds like a lot of this motivation and like kind of the point of this conversation all comes from Sarah's perspective there. But it does seem, I'm curious about others' take on this, but it seems like there could be a decent amount of time that passed from the inception of that idea and when they actually acted on that. Verse 3, so after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abraham. So it almost is like that 10 years is in between that initial idea and when they acted on it. So it's not like it's without, really, thinking about it, yeah.
But this idea that Paul brings out about husbands and wives pleasing each other in their decision is an issue that Paul brings up.
I just see it as Abraham's in a lose-lose situation, right? He was like, yeah, Sarah, great idea. Let me go hook up with Hagar. No, that's not going to look good on him. She would be upset by that. She's also going to be upset when he actually does act on it, and boom, she conceives and bears a child. So it seems like it's a lose-lose for Abraham. But I would also have to say Hagar is a servant. I mean, what servant doesn't do what the master tells them to do and lives to tell the tale or, is hurt physically in some way? But, if Abraham is a friend of God, he's married to a woman that I think also, believes in God. I feel strongly that they probably did pray for quite some time. And if, like Daniel said, there wasn't a lapse in time, perhaps this is where she comes up with this idea. To me, she's very Mary and Martha. She's very busy trying to fix all the problems and do all the things. And her solution, not a right one, is to give him Hagar to fix the situation.
And by the way, we're going to see later in some, if we get there, Sarai's attitude towards not just Hagar, but towards Abram is rather interesting too. And so when we talk about decision making, there's this aspect, and this is I think is really the importance, I think, in some ways of marriage. In general, I'm going to be real general here, men want to take this logically, okay? Logic A, women take it maybe more emotionally and say, well, no, Barbara, you're looking at X, Y, and Z this way to accomplish something. And so, to give you an example, and I don't know if you've read some of these books on this, they talk about how when wives come home and are upset about something at work, men set out to, quote, fix the problem, and the women just want you to listen to the problem. And that's an interesting dynamic. But here, and I want to bring this point out, do our decisions affect others? Now, they maybe not have viewed it this way, but this is a monumental, historic thing that they're about to do that's going to create where we are today. This is not just a small, now, I don't know if they thought of it that way, but we're looking back on it going, wow, this is a really big decision. Had he not taken Hagar, we know God would have allowed allowed Sarai to have a child. But by the fact that they did this, the Abraham says, okay, we're gonna do that, and she brings Hagar along. Those are big decisions. So the question really is, how do our own personal decisions affect others around us, or do we ignore that? Like when we make a decision, do we put ourselves in a little box and say, well, this is just my decision here, and I don't think it affects anybody else. Doesn't affect the ecclesia, it doesn't affect my family or whatever, my career, it doesn't affect anything, it's just my decision. So I don't necessarily answer that question, but I think if you look at decision-making from that perspective, you would sit back and go, well, what are the implications? This tells you that decision-making shouldn't be done rashly. You shouldn't just go right into it and say, this is what we're going to go do, and then find out later, oh, I hadn't considered that. Because Hagar is later going to have Ishmael, and that's kind of the situation we've got today. as a result of this decision. I mean, anyone want to make a comment on that? Do our decisions affect others, and how much of that comes into play when we make a decision?
Well, when we look at it, look at the way it's written and when it was written, you have to take a look at the customs and the way families are, especially in the Middle East. And this makes no distinction between Israeli, Palestinian, Arab, or anything else. In that area of the world and a lot of other areas, the wife is responsible for the house. Everything that happens in the house is her responsibility. The husband's sole purpose is to be in charge. And the way most of those cultures are like, husband simply is the connection from the family to the rest of the community. Anything that happens within the families, and they were pretty isolated back then, okay, is mainly the wife's deal. He deals with like the crops and the farm animals and everything else. And then he's also part of the community that makes decisions for the community as a whole. But something like this would have never even been thought of as a community thing. It is a personal family issue.
Seems so.
Okay, even today it still is in a lot of those areas. So when you look at Sarah's point of view, she's looking at it from a family-only point of view. She's not involved with the rest of the community. As far as the rest of the community was concerned, it's none of their business. Okay, Abraham literally went along with the decision because it was a family-based thing. He didn't need to involve the rest of the community. Now, granted, he needed to involve God at least, and it took them, like they were saying, like 10 years to make this final decision. Okay, for some families, that is a huge thing. That's literally like are you going to adopt somebody? Okay, but we see with the community implications of that, here we are 2,000 years later, and that one incident managed to create an entire new religion that's a third of the entire world.
Yeah.
Okay, so like the saying, the mustard seed in this morning's thing, as small as that is, which this decision would have been back then, look at it now, it's a giant tree affecting the whole world.
But I would also mention here that I think it's worthy of taking that into account, the impact it has on others around us. Because I don't think we live in isolation in our own, we might think we do, that our decisions are just isolated, but maybe not. I think you need to look at a broader picture. So I really want to get into, oh, I'm sorry, there's another comment?
I think it's a great question because we're talking about marriage, so to speak. You know, of course, Hagar was a concubine. And that's a big life move, you know. But I've been listening to talks on Hannah by Roger Lewis lately. And, you know, Hannah made a big decision to dedicate her son to the Lord, you know, at probably the age of 3. And that decision created a legacy for her that affected the whole nation of Israel on a very large scale because of who she trained Samuel to be from such a young age. So, you know, the decisions that we make, especially these ones about our families, in my opinion, can really have a huge impact on our legacy, you know. And I think, you know, in our day, you know, there's a lot of marriage breakups, you know. But a lot of times, I think people think, oh, well, this won't really affect the children. They'll understand. But it has a huge impact on the children. And, you know, these are things we need to think about, that we're not in a little box when we make these decisions.
Yeah, the whole thing of Paul, we're members of one body. In other words, we are supposed to all work together as one, so to speak. But I want to get to this point, and we're running out of time here. Sarah gets very angered at Hagar when Hagar has a child and basically kind of, you know, tells her in different signals, hey, look, I'm having a child, you didn't. And she gets very, very upset about this. Now understand, and this is quite interesting, Sarai is the one that introduced this idea. This is not Abram's idea. And now Hagar is saying, basically in many different ways, to her mistress there, to Sarai, well, I guess you can't have children. I guess it was your fault. Not Abram's fault. I had a child through him. Your fault that you couldn't have a child. This is a really this becomes personal now. And so Sarah makes it really rough on Hagar, so much so that Hagar leaves. And then God has to come intervene and say to Hagar, go back. By the way, you see this later on, Sarai eventually is going to force Hagar out, okay, of the whole situation. And so this raises the whole question, and something else for us to think about is how much emotion may change our decision-making process. These are hard lessons for us all to learn because we all get emotional about certain things, okay? We all say, oh, this must be the right thing to do in a moment of haste or a moment of emotion, strong emotion, whatever. And so this idea, or the question really is Sarai's reaction to Hagar's attitude, was it justified to say, well, I'm going to make this rough on her. She's going to act like that, then I'm going to act like this. She's going to have a really rough time with things. Was that justified on Sarai's part? Sarai said, well, hey, you want to play fire with fire? I'll play fire with you. You know, you want to mock me? Okay, watch what happens. And this gets into the whole idea of relationships, the whole idea, both in our families and at work and wherever we are, relationships and how we treat people, even though our decisions maybe have led us to where we're at, okay? And that's, now I'm gonna throw a little side comment in this, which I really do agree with. Lewis Carroll wrote Alice in Wonderland. By the way, he was on drugs, but that's a whole nother matter. But the point is, the Mad Hatter comes, Alice comes to the Mad Hatter, and she says, what road should I go? And he says, well, which road do you want? And he says, if you don't know, any road will get you there. Any road will, if you don't know where you're going, if you don't know what your decision is, any road's going to take you there. But the problem is when you get there and you say, oh, this isn't where I wanted to be, back up in life a bit, you made a decision back here. You didn't think that through. And I think in the case of Sarai, she hasn't thought this through really well, and maybe not Abram either, but Hagar is actually at the point of telling Abram, you choose between me and this and Hagar. You know, it's your fault, which is amazing. Sarai says basically, Abram, it's your fault this happened. And I'm sure Abram's going, what? It's my fault? You're the one that brought this up. No. You choose now between Hagar and me, and this happens later on, and whether or not you're mistreating Hagar. Now, I'm going to show you, we're not going to get to this today, but later on you have this bigger question when Ishmael is around and they know that they're going to have a child, and Isaac, and so you see here, you know, Sarai wants a Hagar gone. You know, hey, remove her. And she's going to bring up the part about the inheritance. That's a big issue. And now, of course, Abraham is going to talk to God about this. And of course, God says, don't worry, I'm going to bless Hagar, and Ishmael is going to be a great nation in terms of this. And so there are a lot of lessons in this, and by the way, it's throughout the Bible. We're just picking on Abraham and Sarah here. We can go look at the decision-making of Paul. We can go look at David's decisions, things like that. And by the way, some of David's decisions led to the entire almost destruction of his family. I mean, it was like terrible decisions he makes along the way. So and these are saints. I mean, you talk about Abraham and David and Paul. These are people of great faith and well esteemed by God, and yet their decision-making wasn't so great, let's say. And that goes back, we're going to close here because we're running out of time, back to Jeremiah 10, when it says, it's not within man to direct his own paths. And that tells us we have to go pray to God because our decisions aren't always going to be so great. And we have to seek the Lord and say, here's what I propose to do. Is this the right decision? And leave it in the Lord's hands, okay? I mean, and I think that in our lives, we have to face up to this. And again, we can go through a lot of, and you can think of them too, a lot of decisions made in the Bible by people that didn't work out the way I think they intended. So let's stop there for today's class.